Greetings fellow Earthlings and welcome back to Darlingbrough Sci-Fi Builds, and welcome to video 4 in my video series in which I compare model making techniques. So far in this series I have looked at different ways in which underlying structures can be made, multiple methods for making rocks and rock faces, and have also discussed different painting techniques as well. To conclude this series I'm going to be looking at a variety of techniques that can be used to create different terrain that we can use to complete these models. Prior to filming this video, I created some test tiles off camera using the polystyrene construction method that I talked about in the first video. The main bulk of the tiles were created using a plaster and tissue mixture, which I discussed in my rocks and rock faces video, and then I covered them in a variety of different materials. The reason that I created these test pieces was so that I could try out a variety of different terrain ideas that I had before committing to a final look for these two models. On a couple of the test terrain pieces I used some bark similar to how I created rock faces in my second video in the series. I also applied some mixed gravel and stones to one of the tile test pieces, similar to the technique that I used in my airlock door diorama as well. On one of the tiles I have created a crater, and I have also left a tile completely plain as I want to just apply some different flocking materials to it as well. And I also applied a random mixture of greeblies to create some debris. Once the models had dried, I then took them outside and spray painted any areas that would have rocks featured on them with a black matte spray paint. The reason I did this was because I was planning on dry brushing them, something which I discussed in my previous video. Unfortunately, as I was painting the model that had the debris, I actually ran out of matte black spray paint and had to switch to a different spray paint that had a satin finish instead. Now, I previously mentioned that satin finish is not a suitable undercoat to use when you are planning on dry brushing. If you are using, for example, a satin finish or a glossy finish, it will not give you the effect that you're after. It will not give you the effect that you're after. The satin and the gloss will be too shiny. Too shiny. However, I decided that as the debris was going to be mainly metal and metallic, the satin finish might actually work in its favour and create a more glossy and more reflective surface, so it didn't actually turn out to be too much of an issue. For any areas on the test tiles that I was creating where I was planning on creating a natural covering, so one that's covered with phlox or static grasses, I decided to mix up a dark brown paint and gave the tiles a wash to represent some mud. I took particular care on the scenic tile with the random debris painted on it, as I didn't want the mud to be painted over the debris itself. I used a small paintbrush and focused on the areas between the debris. It wasn't perfect, but for this as a test piece, I think it was actually fine. After all of the painting had been completed, I then took advantage of the hot weather that we had in the UK for one day a year and put the tiles on the roof of the shed to allow them to dry naturally. Once the test tiles had finished drying, I then took an opportunity off camera just to have a bit of a play around with different techniques, different materials, and just see what kind of finishes I could achieve. It was an opportunity to try out new materials and techniques that I hadn't actually tried before. So rather than filming it and showing you my trials and errors, I thought I would just show you the final results that I managed to achieve instead. produce the first scenic tile, I used various flocks and materials from popular brands such as Woodland Scenics and Jarvis. I generally find that different flocks actually work together really well, even from different manufacturers. You can combine them and use different shades, and it works to produce a really nice natural finish on a model. For that reason, obviously it's no surprise that these type of materials are often chosen by people interested in building model railways, as it's a very easy and effective way of creating nice, realistic looking scenery. For the second tile, I tried to create a more dry and arid looking scene. Again, I used a mixture of flocks, however this time I went for more earthy tones. This worked really well with the dry brushed rocks that I created, and also I left areas without any material to give the impression of muddy patches on the tiles as well. I feel that this look can be especially effective if you are looking to create a dry desert scene, perhaps a small diorama, or if you are looking to create a model for film or TV perhaps. I also had a play around with some of my own homemade flocks. I created the flocks using some sawdust, water and acrylic paint. Now if I'm honest, I really don't think that this tile worked very well at all, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, I feel that the sawdust that I used was far too dense and too coarse. It should have been a lot finer, and two, the colours that I tended to use were pretty bright and pretty garish. Now I did want to create some sort of bright material to mix in, as I thought that it might work effectively as flowers or as highlights, but by itself I really don't think it works. I think if it was mixed in with other flocks and other materials it could actually be quite effective, but by itself it's definitely not an effective looking tile. It doesn't look very realistic, and it's certainly not one that I'm particularly happy with. I also made an attempt to apply some static grass to one of the scenic tiles as well, and if I'm honest, it really didn't turn out very well either. I think this is down to a combination of reasons. Firstly, it was one of my first times playing around with static grass, and I really didn't know what I was doing. And also, secondly, I was actually using a homemade static grass applicator, which I'll be honest, I don't think is really working. From the understanding that I have from watching other model makers use static grass, I believe it's supposed to stand on end and represent real grass. However, when I applied it, it just looked like it had been dumped on the model. Nothing was standing to attention, and it just looked really flat and dull. Now I must admit I wouldn't mind revisiting static grass again at some point in the future, and I probably will do on my other channel, Darlingbrough Model Railway, so look out for that. But at this stage I really don't think it works for me at all. After trying to recreate realistic looking scenery, I felt that it was then time to have some fun with some of the terrain test pieces as well. With the crater tile, I decided I wanted to make it look really wet, muddy and goopy. I added some dark brown splodges, and then I decided to coat the whole model with some gloss Mod Podge. I then thought it would be fun to have a go using some cheap resin from my local pound shop here in the UK. I added some bright fluorescent green paint to create some toxic green radioactive goop, and I splashed that on the model and left it all to dry. Now I must admit I absolutely love how this turned out. I feel that it's really effective, and I had a lot of fun creating this. Whilst it's not particularly realistic, I think that this is definitely really effective if you want to create some sort of science fiction goopy radioactive scene, or perhaps some sort of dungeon tiles for tabletop gaming or something along those lines. And I definitely would recommend that you have a go at it. I also had a lot of fun with the last tile with all of the greeblies attached. I wanted to turn it into a kind of post-apocalyptic deserted waste ground, something that wouldn't look out of place on a role-playing tabletop game. I had the idea of incorporating junk and random bits of debris early on, so I added interesting greeblies when I was creating it, and this came out really well. To create the floor, I used my own mixture of random flocks, stones and just other basing materials. I then covered the areas where I wanted the flooring to be attached with some PVA, and I just mixed it together and just chucked it all on. It was very quick, very simple, and it turned out very effective. It looked a complete mess, which was exactly the look I was going for. Now you can buy pre-made basing materials that are similar to this, or you can just mix your own just using whatever bits and bobs you've got lying around. I would definitely recommend giving it a go. It's a lot of fun, and you can also tailor your mixture to exactly how you want it. Creating these test pieces before I create the final look for the actual two models has allowed me to A, make a decision on the actual type of terrain that I want to incorporate on the final models, and B, has allowed me to practice the techniques that I'm going to be using before I let loose on my final pieces. I wanted to get into my head how I was going to complete these models before completing the models. I've now made a decision on how I want the scenery to look, and I also know that I can get them to look exactly as I want. Now, if you are creating any kind of scenery, I would obviously recommend creating some test pieces first. If you dive directly into the actual finished piece, there is a chance that you could potentially completely ruin it. After all of the experiments, I have decided to stick to my original design and create a natural looking hill using flocking material. I feel that they will work the best for me and produce a more natural result than static grass, for example. I also have a good mixture of colours and materials available, and I feel that I can create an effective set of terrain pieces. To cover the hills on these dioramas, I'm going to be using a mixture of blended turfs. First of all, I covered the model where I want the grass to appear in a PVA glue. I then started to sprinkle the base colour, which in this case was a green blend, onto the models. I also scattered on some earth blend as well, just to give it more variety and colour. Most of these are from Woodland Scenics, Jarvis and some other mixes in as well. I generally find that they do all blend so that it looks very natural. To add some contrast, I used a dark green scatter from Jarvis. I applied this on the bottom of the hills, on the sides and anywhere where it would naturally be slightly darker. I also applied this around the edges where the rocks protruded from the hills. Once I was happy with the coverage overall, I sprayed the models in isopropanol and then applied a thin watered down PVA mixture. The isopropanol breaks the surface tension and prevents the PVA from beading together. The water and PVA mixture seals the model and prevents any excess flock from falling off afterwards. For this, I personally used a pipette, although you can use a spray bottle, which might be quicker. Once the base layers had dried, everything was completely solid. I then focused on where I wanted to include some specific details, such as bushes and little light tufts of grass. For the bushes, I used a dark green clump foliage. This is a material that you pull off in clumps and stick directly onto the model using PVA glue. I placed the bushes roughly where I wanted them, around the base of where the rocks met the grass, and also at the bottom of the rock face. I added a few onto the top of the hills as well, just for a bit more visual interest. Once these had stuck down, I then sprinkled some light green coarse turf over the top of it. This essentially broke up the colour, giving the bushes highlights. Again, I also sprinkled some on top and stuck it down as before with some watered down PVA glue. I've got a large area where I missed the plaster and it's showing through to the polystyrene. This was very easily covered up using some lichen. Lichen is a mossy product which represents thick growing vines and weeds on areas where there may be running water perhaps. By simply filling the gap full of PVA glue and attaching the lichen, the gap vanishes. And for a final touch, I added some polyfibre to represent some light thin vines and undergrowth growing over the rocks. I just want to ask if you are enjoying the content I'm producing on this channel and want to help support me. You can do by buying me a coffee using the link down below. Any donations go towards tools, equipment and other materials that I use for projects that I feature on videos on this channel. And as a thank you, any people who buy me a coffee will receive links to any new videos that I upload to YouTube on this channel once I upload them, before I make them go live. So if you do buy me a coffee, I do appreciate it. Something to consider. One final spray with isopropanol and a final cover of the model in watered down PVA glue to seal it. Now all I had to do was wait for them to dry. So there we go, 2 matching pieces of terrain built from completely different materials, using completely different construction methods, and painted using completely different techniques. Now, okay, fair enough, when I say matching, I am aware that the rocks and the rock faces are completely different colours. Now the reason for that is basically I chose a completely different colour palette when I was producing them for this video. The reason was because I wanted to differentiate between them and make it easy to identify which one was which. However, as you can see, by using the same colours, the rocks created with bark can match the plaster-based ones. So it just goes to show it doesn't really matter how you build it, as you can achieve the same goals either way. Now obviously scenery like this can be used for a huge variety of different projects. For example, you can use it for tabletop gaming, model railway, you can use it to make small miniatures for film and TV. The possibilities are literally endless. So that brings us to the conclusion of this series. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope that it has inspired you to build some of your own terrain. Now if you do, it would be really interesting to know for what purpose. Let me know in the comments down below. I'd be really interested to hear what your terrain projects are all about. All that's left is for me to say enjoy some of my other videos that I've made on this channel, and just remember, look after yourselves. Remember, the future is not set. There is no fate but what we make for ourselves. Hasta la vista, I'll be back.